This is Sai Kumar Kortewada. In this video, we will learn a complete address management system and we'll develop one particular project which already I have explained in individual series, but I want to make a complete video on address management system so that you can learn and you can experiment all the pieces of code at one place and you can write all the test cases of address management system in this 1 hour video. Please watch this for complete understanding of your reactive forms end to end, along with the validations, along with the form groups, form controls, and form arrays. Hope you will enjoy this whole video. Please watch till end of the video. By end of this video, you will be very familiar with your reactive forms concept. Let me quickly jump into Visual Studio Code. Here I have created a branch RF Reactive Forms Address Management System, and for a couple of videos I'll be using the same branch and the same code. The code will be persisting and I'll not clear that code until we are done with the address management system. So in this video I'll tell you what is this address management system. Address management system is something where the user can add a list of addresses to his bucket, and for that we will be using reactive forms, and also we'll cover validations. And now what I want to do is I want to filter what are the different types of elements or input fields which we require for address management system. First, what I'll do is I'll try to create a form group. Let me create something like register address is my form group, and let me create a constructor, and inside the constructor let me assign this dot register address is equal to, let me use a new form group. We know that how to create a form group. My form group is this one. And before that, let's understand what is the structure which we need to send to the backend whenever we are clicking on a submit button. So for that sake, let me create an object. This is a sample object just to understand what is the structure behind the scene which we are using for this register address. I'm using a name which is of string format, and also email which is of string format, and then addresses. This is an array where each of array element contains an object, and the object should contain city name, state name, and street name and landmark. So in this case, what I'm doing is I want to send this type of object to the backend. So my structure or the reactive form structure should be something like this. And if you see here, the addresses may be n number of objects. So that is the reason I'm using an array. So let me comment this out, and we'll be keeping this aside just to understand what is an object and what is the object which we are trying to frame. Before that, let's understand this is an object. So we want an object structure for the first time. That is the reason I'm going with the form group. Each form group creates one object. So here in this form group, the first element what I require is name. Let me use name, and also let me use it as a control because we are passing some value to this control. Let me create the form control, and let me pass empty string. And next is email. Let me use email, and here let me write new, let me minimize this, yeah, let me write form control, and this form control is also empty by default. And now let me create an array with these addresses as a name. So now how to create a form array? Now we can write something like form array, and inside this array we have a set of objects. So let me create an empty array for the first time, and this is the object. As I said, to create a new object inside a form, we can use a form group. So what I can do, just like enter new form group, because it's an array, so we don't have any name for particular object. And inside this object I have city name as a form control. Let me use this city name as a form control, and then this is of type new form control. So this is my form control and its default value is empty. And also let me use this state name, copy here, paste, and new form control with empty string. And also let me create our street name, and this is something like new form control with empty string. And also we have something like landmark colon, which is of new form control of empty. So now we have created this particular form group or a form array based on this particular object, which is the format which we need to send to the backend API. So now we have created our address form group. Now what I want to do, just I want to bind this register address to my HTML content. So let me go into the HTML content. Let me create a div and let me write some style display flex and justify content center. So just I want to make this center, and also let me give some margin hyphen top 20 pixel. I'm not concentrating on any of the UI part here. I'm just concentrating on the logical part of Angular. So let me create a form, and inside this form, let me create one div. And this div should contain one name and one email, and also the set of addresses with where the addresses should be a set of city name, state name, street name, and landmark. And also for our understanding, let me use ID, which is of new form control. The value of this is something like 1. Let me use a default value as 1. Let me save this. And now here we have to create a form control first. So let me create one input field with a placeholder as enter name. And also let me give an attribute called as name, and my input field is ready. So let me copy this div and paste here. Here what I want to do, I want to have email, and let me use email as a name. So now I have created my first two controls. Now we have third control. Let me create one div for this whole array of format div, and inside this div we have a group. Each group contains ID, city name, state name, and street name, and landmark. So let me create that four fields div, and inside this div let me copy this input field, paste here, and copy this input field 2, 3, and 4. One is for city name, and one more is for state name, and one more is for street name, and last one is landmark. So let me use the same names here: street name, landmark, and state name, and also one more thing, city name. And let me make it as capital letter and name. Save. It is also save. Let's see the UI. Till now I have created only the UI part here, and here you can see enter name, enter email, enter city name, state name, street name, and also enter landmark. And also let me create one submit button. So inside the form let me use button, and for this let me use type as submit, and also submit. Save. Now let me see this. It is having div, and here also what I want to do, just I will create a div, and inside this div let me post this button, and here let me give something like a style of display flex and justify content end. Save this, so it will be moving to the end of that particular form. Here we have created all this, and I don't have any spaces between this, so let me create some spaces for that. And for that sake let me create one class. Go to the SCSS file dot margin hyphen 10. That means I want to create a margin top hyphen 10. Just I want to create a margin hyphen top with 10 pixel. Let me copy this margin top 10 and paste everywhere wherever you require it. Class paste here, and class paste. So we want something like here and here. We copy this class, paste, 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 and paste. Let me save this. Now you can see there would be some spaces, but there is something wrong between the, we got an error. Let us check that error. So form tag has not been closed properly. Why? So div and div, and okay, so here inside the closing tag we have used it. We have to use only in the opening braces. So let me use here, save. and now compile successfully. Now we got some spaces, and we don't have a section to differentiate our city names and the address management as well as the name and the email of the user. So that's why what I want to do, just I want to separate these particular data. So let me use a paragraph where I'll use address details. Save this and go here. Now it is address details. All the address details are available here in this. Enter city name, state name, and street name as well as landmark. Here we have created the UI, and also we have our form, which is like register address form. Now I want to bind this register address with my form. What I'll do is just I'll create a form group for the first element, that is a form with form group. Let me use form group, and for this we have a form group name called as register address. Inside this register address I have a name form control. So where is my name input field? This is my name input field, and we can use something called as form control name. Already we discussed about the form controls in our previous video. Please watch for better understanding. And let me copy this form control name and paste here, and the second form control is email. Let me copy this email and pass this email. But now the problem here is we have addresses. Addresses is a form array. So to go into this form array, we need to target for these addresses first. So now what I'll do, just here we have a div, and here also we have a div. So this div indicates the array of elements where we are using the city name, state name, and street name, and also landmark. Now what I want to do, just I want to add my form array name. That means here from this division my form array name will be instantiated. And why we are not giving the property binding? Because we are using a direct a string value, not the dynamic value. Here we have created our form array name. Now inside this form array we have a array of groups. That means whenever I am inserting one value into this form array, a group will be created. So now I want to create a group. Before that, this is a form array. So just I want to loop this form array. How can we loop this form array? So for that sake, let me create ng-container, and inside this container we will be using all this whole division. Let me format this. Here star ng for, we have discussed about the ng for in our Angular tutorial video. I'll provide the link in the description. Please watch. Let control, I'm getting the control of, what is my control name? The addresses. But this addresses you need to get it from register address. So let me get this from register address dot get of addresses, because this is a dynamic value. So now I'm getting from addresses, and it should be looped. So whenever if you want to loop it, you have to get the controls dot controls. And let me save this. If you see here, we got an error. Object is possibly null. Why? Because these controls may be undefined or may not be undefined based on the array, because array is something like a list of content, and also the get is always referring to a control. That means and for either a form group, either a form control or form array. We are not telling that it is a form array. So for that sake, what we can do is we can typecast this. So for typecasting this, let me go to our TypeScript and create a getter function. Get, and this is my getter function. Inside this getter function, what I can write, I want to get addresses array. So addresses as form array. This is a name which I want to give, and what is the return type for this? It should return a form array. Now how we can typecast it? Already we have discussed in the form array how to typecast this form arrays in my previous video. I'll provide the link in the description. And here this dot register address dot get of, I will be getting this addresses. And what we can do, we can use alias name like as, so it will typecast into form array. And this is how we can get our form array. And let me use this addresses as form array inside my ts dot controls. Save this and also save this. Let me check. Yeah, compile successfully. Now we can loop this address, but whenever we are looping, addresses is our array, and inside this array each and every index points to one group. So now let me create that index. Let I equal to index. Our I indicates the form group. So now inside this what I want to do, just I want to write the index value here where which address it is pointing to. And also let me create one div, and let's wrap all the input fields inside the div. Let me format, and now this div indicates a form group, and now the form group is dynamic. It is not static because the form group is equivalent to our index value. So index value varies, hence my form group name also varies. Form group name is equal to I. That means the index value of this form group. Now inside this form group I have ID, city name, state name, street name, and landmark. That means we have all the individual controls. Already we have created our input fields, just we need to map with our form control name, and form control names are not dynamic, hence we don't want to use property binding. Let me use city name, copy this and paste here. Let me write the same form control name for every field, and let's change the names of the form controls as per the object which is created in the reactive forms. So state name and street name, and last one landmark. Let me copy this landmark and paste here. Let me save this. Now everything was successfully compiled, and whenever we click this submit, we are using a type submit. Let me write one submit event, ng submit. Whenever it is submitted, I want to call one method like submit, and inside this submit let me write console.log of this dot register addresses dot value. So this should hold all the values which we are entering inside our HTML. Let me copy this and paste here with parentheses. Let me save this. So as we are giving this button as submit, and inside the form this will be calling this ng submit event whenever I click this button, and we are rendering or we are consoling the values which are entered in this particular format, and that format should be displayed in the response as this object. So let me go back and clear it off. Let me reload for our sake, and let me remove all these values and submit. Yeah. So now let me give Sai Kumar, sai@gmail.com, and you can see the index value. That means this is the first index where address details are shown. And let me give the city name. Now city name is Hyderabad, and state name something like Telangana, street name Boduppal, landmark Chengicherla, something like this. And let me click on submit. You can see the name, email, and addresses. Inside the address you got ID which is not inside this element, but we have hard coded that value. And also we found the city name which was entered here, and we have entered Chengichella as a landmark here we got, and state name Telangana, Boduppal as street name. So this was inside an array. If you see this object is equivalent to the object which we have framed here. If you see this, that is same as it is of this object. That means just we are not transforming any of the data once the form is submitted. We have created our form to create such data without any transformations. So this is one of the advantage of reactive forms, where you will be creating the original format and no need to transform any data before you send the data to the backend. Now what we will do is we will add one button to our HTML content. Let me add button, and let me use something like add address and also type as button. So I have created this add button. Now let me check that. So we have add button, and let me place this add button on the right side. So use a div, and for this div let me create a style as display flex justify content end, and inside this div let me paste this button. Now the button will be moving to the end of that screen, and you can see here. Now I want to add one event for this, where whenever I click this event, then that form array will be having one extra address with all these fields in that. So add address, this is my method. Let me define this method in my TypeScript. So go here, define this method, and in this method what we want to do, just we want to add our whole group of elements into this address. So how can I do that? Already I have typecasted that into a form array using this variable, this dot addresses as form array dot push. There is a method called as push, and inside this push I want to push all these form group details. Let me copy and paste here. So now I'm pushing whole the group with all the fields, but this time my form control value should not be equal to 1. Why? Because it should be always plus 1 of the previous one. So I can use this dot addresses for as form array dot controls dot length. What are my controls? Previously it is 1 and I should have plus 1 now. So let me save this, and also let me save this. Go back, clear, and click on this. You got one more address details, and you got one more address details too. Now what I will do, just I'll fill these values, Sai Kumar and Sai @gmail.com, and don't give the space. Here let me use Hyderabad, Telangana, Boduppal and Chengichella. Let me use Hyderabad 1, Telangana 1. I can give any values, Boduppal 1 and Chengichella 1. And here let me give Hyderabad 2, Telangana 2 and Boduppal 2 and also Chengichella 2. Let me click on submit. So if you see here, we have one name, one email, but three addresses which consist of all the ID, city name, state name and street name. If you open this, we have ID1. ID1 indicates the first one, which contains Hyderabad, Chengichella, Telangana, Boduppal. And if you see the second one, we got all the second updated values. And if you see the third address, you got all the third address details. So that's how we can add a number of addresses into our address management system, and we can send whole this data to the backend whenever we want to save the data. Now just a small change here. What I want to do here is, first thing, we are adding one address by default when our application is loaded. I don't want to do that. Why? Because now we got a add address button. Whenever the user want to add it, he will be adding, otherwise it will be empty. So I can just comment this and save this. Now you can see you will not have any default address. On clicking on the add address, you will be getting one address. And also there is one more problem. If you see this code and the code which we wrote here, they are equivalent. That means same. So I can remove this code and I can make it as an empty array by default whenever the application is loaded. And on clicking on this add address, we are adding n number of times this group. But if we want to remove some group or add at some particular time, then we cannot reuse this. We should always copy and paste this. Instead, I'll try to create a method like get address form group, and this is of type form group. And here just I'll try to return the same logic which I wrote here. Cut this and paste here. Now in this case, we are returning whole form group, and whenever I call this get address form group, all this form group will be called or returned. So here, instead of using all the code, I'll use something like this and with this keyword. So now we are making it simplified. We can use this group in the future whenever we require it. On clicking on other button or doing some XYZ operations, we can use this form group as a individual function and can be called wherever we require. That we call it as reusable functionality, and it is doing only a particular task. Let me go back, clear it off, and let me check again. Add. You can see here address details, and now let me give Sai Kumar @gmail, and let me give Hyderabad, and let me give Telangana, and let me give Boduppal, Chengichella, and let me give Hyderabad 1, Telangana 1, and Boduppal 1, 1, and submit. If you see here, we got all the fields of that addresses which we have entered in this UI. And also, and if I want to delete this or delete this particular index, I just want to have a button or an icon to delete this. So let me create a button for each and every address which we want to delete. So let me go here and let me create one button, and this button indicates type as button and remove address. So what I'll do, just I'll create one div, and this div, let me have a button and format this, and let me use a style attribute, display flex justify content end. So we'll be showing this particular remove address button on the right side of each and every address. If you go here and click on add address, you can see remove address, and also clicking on this remove address. So we are seeing this remove address. When the user clicks on this remove address, this has to be removed completely from our DOM. So let me go here and use an event called as click event, and let me use remove address method, and let me define this method, copy this and go here. Let me use a method called as remove address, and which we want to remove. So we have many addresses in the DOM, and we have to tell this method which I want to remove. Let me pass the index for this, so that will remove that particular index value. Index colon, it should always be a number type, and this will not return anything, so void. Now I already have the address as form array, which is already typecasted into form array. So I can use this form array. So let me copy this. Let me use a method called as remove at which index, so I can pass the index which we are clicking on. Let me save this and go here, save this. When the user clicks on this, it will go and it will remove this particular index value, and the UI will be getting updated. Let me go here and let me add two addresses, address 1 and address 0. So let me enter Hyderabad, and here Hyderabad 1. So now what I want to do, just I want to remove this particular address, like address 1. So let me click on this. You can see the address which we have previously, that is existing in our DOM, and let me click on add address, add address. If you see here, address details 2, address detail 1 and address detail 0. So let me enter Hyderabad as 1 and also Hyderabad as 2. Let me remove this first one, address details 1, and let me clear it off. If you see here, we have Hyderabad, Hyderabad 2, but the index value has been changed. That means add address details should have index as 2, but we have 1. Why? Because the value whatever we are showing here, that is not respective to your address, it is relevant to your index. So whenever we remove some value, the index value will change, and this will be not an appropriate one. Let's try to fix that. Instead of using let me use control dot get method of id and dot value, because we are getting a form control, and to get the value of the form control we have to use id and value. So we can use something like this, save. Yeah. So if you go here and click on the add address, you got 1 as the first one, because we are already using a +1 on the total length. So total length will be 0 for the first time, and 1 will be added to it. So my id value is 1, and let me add 2 and 3. So now let me give some value, Hyderabad and Hyderabad 1 and Hyderabad 3. Let me change it to 2, and let me change it to 1. So now on removing of 2, you will not see any index change in this, because we are not targeting for the index. Instead we are using an id. Let me click on remove address, and if you see here, address details 3 and address detail 1. So this indicates that our respective address whole array element has been removed from our DOM, and remaining all are re-rendering. And here, to make it more precise, we can use remove address with some ID like this. Let me copy this ID and paste here. Save this. Now you can see remove address 1 and remove address 2 and remove address 3. So now let me click on 2. 1 and 3 are existing, and 2 has been removed. Let me click on 3, and 3 has been removed, and let me click on 1. 1 has been removed. So no records has been existing in our DOM. Now what we can show is, here we are not showing any addresses, so we can show some note where if the user does not have any address, then we can show as no records or no addresses found. So let me try to do that. Now let me create ng-container, and this container should exist ng if is equal to, whenever your controls are dot length, length length is less than or equal to 0, then I have to show a message like no addresses found. So let me save this and go back. If you see here, no address is found, and clicking on this, you are not seeing that error message. As it is a warning message, let me use style and color as orange. Save this and go here. If you see here, no address is found, and when the user clicks on add address, the address is shown, no address are found. So now our case is I want to validate these fields along with the form fields of an array. So now let me go to the app.ts, and here let me give a validations. So here I am not using a direct array. Instead of I am using validators.compose, which will take an array of validations. Let me pass validators.required, and also let me pass validators.min length of 5. So I want to have a minimum length of 5 characters for this name. And also let me give one more validator for this email. So let me go to validators dot required. I want to use required on this, and also I want to use validators dot pattern, because we need to have an email pattern. So already I have that regex in my readme file. Let me get that readme file and let me copy this and paste here. So I have the pattern for this validation, and then let me save this. And also we have a group, that is a form group, which will be added into your form array whenever you are clicking on add address button. So here I want to add only few validations, that is validators.compose of, I want to add only required validation, because the city name can be anything. And also I want to have a validators.compose of validators.required for this state as well as a street name, and array of validators.required. So we have required for this, and I want to have an optional for my landmark. Let me save this. And now for validating this in the UI, let me go to the HTML and let's validate this by using a div and a paragraph. So let me use a paragraph, and inside this paragraph I want to show some error message. Let me show statically this is required is one of the message. Let me save this and go here. Here you can see this is required. So for now let me inspect this and make it a fancy UI. Let me click on this, and I want to remove all the margins as 0 pixel, and then I want to add a color as red and font hyphen size as 12 pixel. So now this is my CSS. Let me copy this CSS and go to your app.css, and here what I want to do, just add dot error class, and inside this error class let me paste this, copy this error and paste here inside this class. So save. Now this field will be in required state, but when we have to show this, whenever this field is invalid or touched or dirty, we have to show this particular first name validations. So for that sake, let me create ng if, and I want to get this form control. How to get this form control? We have a form group called as a register address, and we can get the value by using a get method, and we can get the value of that property called as name. And let me use a question mark, because this get method we may be returning a control or maybe null, but the compiler doesn't know whether it is returning a null or an control. So let's use question mark, and after that let me use invalid, and I want to get this register address dot invalid, and it should be touched, and also it may be dirty. So let me use dirty, and whenever these three conditions satisfy or any of the two conditions satisfy, then it will come inside and it will print this is required. Let me save this, and here if you go, for the first time it is not showing anything. Let me close this and let me touch and come out. You are getting this is required. And also let me check, you have some other validation, something like validation with min length. So minimum length we have to give 5. 1 2 3 4 5. Now it is valid, but whenever it is 4, this is required. It's a invalid message which we are showing for the user. For that sake, what we can do, we can specify the error messages based on the type of the error. So I can write star ng if whenever this register address dot get of name question mark dot errors question mark dot required. Whenever it is required, then only we want to show this is required. To know about this pattern, I have created already the validation video in this series. Please watch that for better understanding. And now let me create one more paragraph. Let me use the same pattern, but this time instead of required, I'll use min length. And please enter minimum of 5 characters. Let me save this, go back, and now let me click here. You saw this is required. Let me enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You are not getting any messages. Why? Because we need to provide min length and this way. Save this. Now click here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So whenever you are giving 5, it is not showing any error, but whenever you are giving less than 5, it is showing please enter minimum of 5 characters. So as per our expectation, we are getting this error messages. But here if you see, we are writing a very lengthy code. So every time whatever we want to validate, we have to validate with all these validations. Instead, what I'll do, just go to the TS file and let me write one method called as is field valid. So let me check this field is valid or not. It will receive a form group. Let me give any, and also a form control name, which is of string type. So now I want to give this form group, and based on that conditions, what is my condition? Here I have this condition. Whenever this is true, then only I want to validate. Let me copy this, and if my values satisfies this, that means instead of using register, we will be using this dot register, and also this dot register, and this name should be something like dynamic. So let me use this form control name, and here also let me use a form control name. So now here in this case, I have a group which is equal to my register address. So instead of using this, I'll use form group because I want to send that group from my HTML content. So here also we can use form group, and here also let me use form group. And whenever this condition is true, I want to return true, else I want to return false. So let me use this field here. Instead of using all this, let me use this is field valid. I want to send the group for the first time. My group is register address and my form control is a name. Let me pass this name. And also let me create a error validity. So let me use get field error by type. So here also I can pass a group form group with any and a form control name with string, and let me pass one more thing like type which is of string. This time what we can do, just we can validate in the same way. Copy this and return this one. Instead of using a group, I can use form group. Instead of name, we can use something like a form control name, and instead of required, I can use something like type. So now this will be returning that particular type exists or not. Let me give like this. Now we can use get field error by type and pass here. We can pass three parameters. One is our form, and the second one is my control name, and third one is type. This time our type is required, and the same thing we can use in this, but this time our last parameter will be min length. And let me save this, go here and let me validate. Click here outside, this is required 1 2 3 4 5. It works the same way, but why we have created in this pattern? Because we can reuse these methods and we can reduce our HTML content. Let me copy this and paste here for the email. In this case, same register address is a group, and Instead of name, we need to pass email, email, and email. This time we need to pass the pattern. Why? Because if you see the validations, we have only two validations for email. One is required and one is pattern. So I have passed this pattern inside here, and let me change the name of this. So please enter valid email and save this. So here, let me touch this email and come out. You got this email is required, and let me give sai@gmail. Even though you are not getting this particular email validation. Why? Because can't read the properties of null of required. That means it is not able to read the properties of that null. Why? Because here we are using a name. Instead of this name, let me pass this form control name. Save this and go to the HTML. Let's check it is valid or not. Yes, we are passing the valid pattern and everything, and go back. Now let me touch this and come out. You got this is required. Let me type something sai@gmail.com, and you didn't got any error. And let me remove this at the rate and invalid pattern. So then it is showing please enter a valid email. And now let me pass .com and let me give Sai Kumar. Click on add address. Now we want to validate city name, state name, street name, as well as landmark. In this case, we need to validate an addresses array. Inside that array, we have a number of groups, and inside that group, we have a city name. So now how to validate it? Let me copy that particular error div and paste below. So I have pasted here, and here what we need to pass, we need to pass a group. In our case, the group is something like a control is my group, and let me pass the form control name as city name, and here also let me pass city name, and let me pass this control. Each control indicates one group. You can see here we have shown the value of an id by using control.get of an id.value. This control indicates a group. So I'm passing the group and a city name, and let me save this. Go back, clear it off, and let me give add address. Let me touch here, come out, this field is required. Let me go back and same scenario. Let me copy this and paste at the state name and replace that city name with my state name, and same thing, copy and paste here. Let me replace that state name with street name and save this. Go back, clear, and let me touch this, come out, this field is required, Sai Kumar. We are having more than 5 characters, and sai@. So you have a invalid pattern, and let me give the valid pattern. Let me click on add address. Let me touch this, come out, this field is required, this field is required, and this field is required. And for landmark, we didn't wrote any specification. And now let me enter the value city name and give state name Telangana, street name Bodpal, and landmark if we want to give we can give, otherwise we can ignore. But if you observe one thing, let me remove this. Even this form is valid, we are showing a submit button. That should not be the case. If any of this field is invalid, we should disable this button and we should not do any action further. So for that sake, we can use a property called as disabled. So I'm using a property called as disabled by using a property binding. And let me take the form name. What is my form name? Here if you see, my form name is register address. Inside this form, I should not have any invalid data. If we have any invalid data, I want to disable. How to find the invalidity? We can use invalid property on the address form, and on top of this register address we are checking invalid. So if any field is invalid, then this will be disabled. Let me save this, go back, and for the first time it will be disabled, and let me enter Sai Kumar, and now it was enabled. Why? Because we don't have any field inside the addresses. When once you click on add address, you are seeing some addresses where it is invalid, and you are seeing a submit with a disable. So let me give Hyderabad, Telangana, and even it is disabled because the street name is required. Give the board apple, now it is enabled. And now after clicking again with this add address, again it was disabled. Why? Because these fields are invalid. So reactive forms is smart enough to check all the details inside the form if we are giving proper validations in our form groups. And give this board apple, now it is enabled. Click on submit, you get a name and an email and an address with a valid data. So here the validations will work in this way, and you can remove this If you remove here, it is fulfilled, and if I remove this particular value, it was disabled. So that is how your disabled and validations will work in Angular forms with along with the form group and form controls. Let me summarize this. So why we have written these two methods? The main part of these two methods is, instead of writing every time all this logic invalid, touched and required and dirty, we have created our own methods which will be validating by receiving a required parameters. In this case, my required parameter is a form group and a form control, form group, form control, and the type. Hope we have covered most of the scenarios in our reactive forms. The last one scenario is, for example, if you are going with a edit form, that means already you have added at least 2 or 3 addresses into your fields and you want to view that content. So how to do by using reactive forms? For example, on the load of this page, I'm getting some data and I want to show all the addresses here. We'll be trying to do all that by using patch value over a form group. So already we have a form and already we have some data, something like this. So let me enable this, and now let me give some name. This is our structure which we discussed in the first video of this address management system. Whenever we are creating the reactive form, the same structure I am using, sai@gmail.com. This is my name, and we have something like an ID. Let me pass this ID as 1, and city 1, and state 1, and street 1, and we have something like landmark. These are my details which are in my first address form. Let me copy this and replicate this here. Let me make it this id as 2, and let me mark it as 2, 2 and 2. Let me save this and let me remove this landmark. Let me assume that we don't have any landmark for this second address. So in this case, in general, what we usually do is, we will be creating our form and then we'll be patching our values with this particular object. So let me write the same stuff. This dot register address dot patch value of my object, this dot obj. So now I passed patch value for this and we have an object. Let me save this, go here, and if you see here, the name and the email are getting filled, but it is not filling the addresses because we have two addresses. That two address has to be rendered here. Why it is not doing that? Let's understand. Whenever our application is loaded, we'll be going into the constructor, and inside the constructor we are creating a register form, and this register form have an address where it is having empty fields. That means it is assuming that it doesn't have any fields, and whenever there is no fields inside this address, I'm not able to patch the value for that particular addresses. Whereas we have name and email which are already existing in my form, and then I am able to assign or give these values. For that sake, how we will be resolving? So let's assume we have an object. Inside this object we have something like two addresses. That means inside these addresses also we should have two addresses which are like default addresses. So let me do that. This dot obj dot addresses is an array, and we can use something like for each, and inside this for each I have a callback function and we'll be getting an object. So I don't care about the object for now. So what I can do, just like this dot add address. So already we have add address logic. Let me demonstrate that. So in this add address, what we are doing, just we are pushing the default addresses. That means empty addresses. You can see here we have all the ID, city name, state name, street name, and landmark. So now I want to override these default values with my patch values. Already we are executing this logic and then we are patching our values. So after executing this logic, I'll have two addresses in my particular form because it is looping for the two times, and that two values will be assigned to this addresses array, and after that we will be overriding the default values with the values which we got from the obj. Let me save this and go back. If you see here, we have all pre-filled values, and we can also add one more address. That will be a new address which are not getting from the backend, but we have already 1 and 2 and 3. So now what we understood. So whenever you are patching the values for an array, make sure that number of objects inside that particular array should exist in your form. To exist in that form, create a default forms, and then after creating the default forms, give a patch value. I have explained about patch value and the set value in this reactive form series. Please watch that if you have any doubts. So now, whenever you want to create a service instance, then you will be using a reference for that. So private, I can use a private because I can restrict to that particular class. So now I'm using a private with form builder. I can give any name, and also a form builder which is given by Angular. And now let me save this. Form builder is a service. As a service indicates, it is providing some utilities to use instead of using directly. So what are the utilities which are provided by this form builder? Let's see. And this type of reference assignment is called dependency injection. We'll discuss about dependency injection in further classes. But for now, remember, whenever you have a service, you can inject a service into your component inside your constructor parameter, and that can be used to utilize all the utilities. So it is same like form group and form control, but just the syntax difference. So now let me use this dot form builder dot, there is a method called as group. So we can just replace all the values of that form controls and the form groups by using form builders. This dot form builder dot control, and I can pass this control. Now let me use one more form builder, this dot form builder dot control, and also this is an array. Now I can use this dot form builder dot array. So now you may be having a question, inside the form builder, if I use directly a new form control, will it affect anything? No, absolutely no. So our form builder is an advantageous service where we can use, instead of using a new keyword for every group as well as a control. So here the advantage of using a service is all this group will be engaged and will be holded inside your particular form builder instance. Instead of creating a group instance, control instance, what it will do, it will create one instance and it will add all our form groups inside that instance. Here, instead of using form group, I can use this dot form builder dot group, and also you can pass here this dot form builder dot control. Let me copy this and paste here, here, and here. Let's save this. Now it should work as it is. So let me go back to the browser, and here let me reload. Now if you see, it is not showing any errors in our console, and also we are able to see all the addresses. Why? Because it has two addresses by default in this object, so it is showing all the two addresses with the pre-filled values. So in the same way, we can add extra elements to this, and also we can remove that extra elements. We can add one more address, we can add one more address. We are seeing 4, and we can remove 3, and we can remove 2. So everything will work as expected. The only difference in using individual controls or groups or an array, instead of that we can use a form group where the instance will be created only one time and all the remaining groups controls will be hosted onto that particular instance. That is the reason we are using a service. So here whenever we are pointing with a reference, that is called as a singleton service. That means the builder will be created only one time, and then you can utilize that particular instance space for creating our groups and controls and arrays. Hope this will give a good exposure onto reactive forms. Here we have created an object by default, and whenever our application is loaded, it will be trying to call this constructor. Whenever the constructor is called, then I am doing a patch value. That means the patch value with this object. By default, my form should contain two addresses and also one name and an email with this Sai Kumar and sai@gmail.com. So let's try to validate this particular form by default. So let me go into the spec file, and here let me create two variables. One is fixture, and it is of type component fixture and assigned with app component, and also let component instance app component. So I have created a fixture and a component instance. Let's initialize that. Fixture is equal to, once the test bed is configured, then test bed dot create component of app component. So now the app component fixture is ready. Now we can create the component instance by using this fixture dot component instance. And let me write one it statement where we are checking values with default object check. So we are checking the default object values, and let me have a callback function. Inside this callback function, let me update the fixture first. Fixture dot detect changes, and once the fixture is stable, then I'll be getting a callback function, and inside this callback function, let me write our test cases. So now by default, I have an object. So in this object, I have name and an email and an address. What we can check is, let me go to the HTML file, and here we have input fields. So for example, this is one input field with name and email, and how many times we are having these addresses, that is 2 times. You can see here 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. So total we need to have 10 input fields by default. Let me check that. Const elements colon HTML input element with an array, because we will be getting all the input elements, and we'll be using our fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector all. So we are targeting for all the input fields. I'm passing this element selector. Now our expectation is expect of elements dot length should be equal to 10. By default, the object is having 10 input fields. Let me save this and go to the application where I am running ng test. So one test case has been successfully passed. Now the next scenario is, by default, we are assigning all these object values to my register address by using a patch value. Let's test this register address. So now the register address expectation is expect of, we have something like a component instance dot obj dot, or just we can use something like json dot stringify. Let me stringify this object, and I will be checking with to equal of our json dot stringify of component instance dot register address dot value. So the value whatever we have inside this register address, that should be equivalent to your object whenever we are stringifying. Let me save this. Now you can see one is success. That means two expectations with one it description was successfully completed. Now let me use one more expectation. The expectation is expect of our component instance dot register address, and inside this address we have addresses. So how to get that addresses? We have a method called as addresses as form array. Let me use component instance dot address as form array dot length, that should be equal to equal of component instance dot obj dot addresses dot length. So our addresses length should be equal to the addresses array which was framed. So here the object is having two addresses, one address and two address. So we should have a length of two addresses in my form. Let me save this. Now it was successfully passed. And now when the user clicks on add address, so we are adding one address with 4 fields. That means 4 extra fields. This is a new form group. And whenever these are added, these are invalid data because these are not filled yet. So that is the reason we are disabling the submit button. Now this is a manual type of testing. Now we'll do the same stuff in unit testing. I'll try to get this button, and when the user clicks on button, these fields will be added and this button will be disabled. Let me go to the Visual Studio Code, and now let's search for the add address. So here we have an add address. Let me add an ID. ID is equal to address ID, or make it readable, add address ID. And now let me go to the spec file. Let me create it, and inside this it, let me write test colon add address checks, and it will have a callback function. Inside the callback function, you'll be getting that fixture dot debug or detect changes, and once the detection is done, that means when it is stable, then what we need to do, we need to get a callback function, and inside this callback function, first I'll try to get this button. So what is my button? Add address ID. Let me get that button. Const add button colon HTML button element is equal to fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of, what is my ID? It's hash, add address ID, and now we bought that button. Once the button is clicked, we are calling add address method. So where is this add address method? It is already existing in my TS file. Let me go to the spec file and let me create a spy-on function for that. Add address spy is equal to spy-on of I component instance, comma, what is this? Add address. That means the method name. The method name is add address. Let me copy this and paste here. And whenever the user clicks on this, I want to call this. So there is a utility that is nothing but a call through. I have explained about event handler testing in the same series. Please watch before continuing for better understanding. Let me go here, and when the user clicks on the button, let me get the button dot click. There is an event on this button called as click, and when the user clicks on this, what is my expectation is my spy on function should call at least one time. That means to have been called times of one. And let me go to the HTML, save this spec file, save this. Now it has been successfully passed. And when the user clicks on the button, what is happening to the UI? The UI will be adding one more fields. Like clicking on this, it will add 4 fields, that is a new form group into our form array. So this one we need to test it. That means already we have 2 plus 4 6, 6 plus 4 10, 10 elements already existing. When the user clicks on add address, 4 more elements has to be added. So now in this case, what it will do, let me check fixture dot detect changes. Why? Because there is a change happened in my TS that is not known to the HTML. So we are telling the HTML to detect the changes once again and make it stable. Whenever it is stable, then I'll have a callback function. Inside this callback function, we have to check all the input elements. That means already we have 10 input elements, and now we have added 4 more elements. So our elements length should be equal to 14. That means we should have 14 input elements. Const input elements colon HTML input elements array is equal to fixture dot debug elements dot native element dot query selector all of what is the type for this input type. So you will be getting the input type, and what is our expectation is input elements dot length should be equal to 2 equal of 14. Save this and check here. It has been successfully passed. Now we have tested this one, but now we need to test about the submit button. So submit button should be disabled. Let me give an ID for that submit button. Let me go to the submit button and provide some ID. ID is equal to submit ID. Save this and let me copy this ID. Let me get this button. So const button submit colon HTML button element is equal to fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of an ID. What is my ID? It's hash, and we got the ID expect of button submit dot disabled. There is a functionality called as disabled, and it should be equal to true. That means to be truthy. And let me save this. Because our input fields has not been valid, so this button will be in disabled state, and it has been passed successfully. So we have tested how to add our address, and whenever we are adding the address, what are the different things which are happening to our HTML. We have tested it. And when the user clicks on add address, a new group will be added. Whenever I click on the remove address, that remove address will be removing a particular address form group from our application. So now let me quickly jump into the Visual Studio Code and test our application. So here let me write one it statement, and inside this it let me write a description like test remove address feature, and let me use a callback function, and inside this callback function let me get the ID first. So here we will be having a number of IDs, as this remove address will be existing for each group. So let me use an ID is equal to remove underscore address underscore one. So I want to remove this address, and let me save this and go to the spec file and write fixture dot detect changes. I'm detecting the changes, and once the detect changes is done, let me wait for stable and whenever it is stable, I can use a then callback function, and inside this callback function, let me write const remove element colon html button element is equal to fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of what is my selector, it's a hash, and remove button is my selector. Let me go to the html, copy this remove address hyphen underscore one, and this time it is not one. Why? Because it is in a looping state. So let me use an I, that means remove address 1, remove address 2, that will be changing based on this index value. So now let me save this and go to the spec file. Here I am using 1, that means I am trying to delete the first one, and whenever I click on this particular remove element, then my html remove address will be called. Let me create a spy for this remove address. So remove address spy is equal to spy of component instance comma remove address. The name of the function is remove address. Let me copy from this ts file and paste here. Now it has to call with args of 1 and dot call through. Why I am using with arguments as one? Because this remove address is expecting one argument. The argument is I, that means the index value. I can use any of the index value, and in this case I am using the one index, that means the second parameter or the second value. Or else you can even no need to use this with args. Why? Because already you are pointing to the id which is 1. So now whenever I click on this element, remove element dot click, whenever I am clicking this, it should call my spy. So our expectation is expect of remove address spy dot to have been called times of 1. It should call one time, and once I click this, my remove address will be called and it will update my address form. So let me update my fixture dot detect changes. When the detect changes is stable, that means fixture dot when stable, then I need to have a callback function, and inside this callback function we can test how many elements present in that particular array. So our expectation is expect of form group, that is component instance dot form address as form array dot length, it should contain only one. Why? Because by default it has two, and I'm removing by using a click event. So now it should be equal to 1. So it should have only one element. So here array form length is equivalent to 1. Why? Because we have removed the addresses array, that means the first element of that array which is pointing to the index of 1, I have removed it. And whenever I am removing that particular data in our address form, then our expectation is something like a object without that addresses. For example, I have clicked on this, so my object should not contain the first one, that means id2, and this one should not be there in my objects. So what is my addresses should be there? So let me use something like const addresses is equal to array which is containing only one test data, that is this one. Why? Because the index of this is 0, so I am removing 1. And now let me expect of component instance dot address as form array, and let me use dot value, and this value should be equal to, that means json dot stringify of this one should be equal to to equal of json dot stringify of the addresses test data. This is the addresses test data, and it should be equal to this addresses test data. Save this. Now it has been passed. Even without creating the test data also we can do, that is nothing but const obj addresses is equal to component instance dot obj dot splice or addresses dot splice of, I want to remove that splice one, that means the first index and the one count. So I can remove this, and now these obj addresses will be containing the removed value. So I just want to have component instance dot obj that will be containing the original object which is equivalent to this value, because I have deleted that value from that particular object. So here if you see, we are getting all the addresses because name and addresses email we are getting. Just I want to check the addresses, so you can use dot address. save this. Now you can see all the three test cases has been passed. That means we are checking the spy on function whether that function is getting called or not, and also we are testing the length of the array, and also we are testing the values which are present in that particular array. Already we have tested few of the scenarios like address adding, address removable, and also we have checked the patch value of a particular addresses. Now what we'll do is we'll try to validate this particular form on clicking on a add or removing the elements or changing the element values. So for that sake, let me go and create one if statement where I will try to validate email not found and also form array values. So now what is our strategy here? We have to update our fixture.detect changes. Once the changes are updated, that means fixture.when stable, then we'll get a callback function. Inside this callback function, what I want to do, just I want to update this email. So if I go top level, so we have a email id, that means here, and already we have a validation for this email id which is defined in our TS. If you go to the TS and email, inside the email we have a required and also a pattern. Let me go with the required one. So by default this email is having some value like sai@gmail.com, but what I'll do is just I'll change that values of that particular object. For doing that, I can access this particular email by using email id, and let me copy this and get this email element which is of type HTML input element equal to fixture.debug element dot native element dot query selector of what is my selector, it's an id, so hash and email id. Now you got that email element. Let me change the value of that email element by using value property. Value is equal to empty, and to change this detection and to understand about the events, what we'll do, just I'll dispatch an event over this email element like event, new event of input event. So whenever I dispatch this event, it will try to update our form control. Now fixture dot detect changes and fixture dot when stable, whenever my form control has been updated, then what I should get, I should get an error message. What is that error message? First check is you need to get this particular error message. So let me add one id is equal to email required. So let me copy this and get this particular element. So const required email element which is of type paragraph. So HTML paragraph element is equal to fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of I want to get an ID with required email required. And what is our expectation here? Expect required element should not be null. That means not to be null. It should not be null. Let me save this. And if you see here, it has been successfully passed. And also one more expectation is expect that required value element dot inner HTML should be equal to the error message whatever we are providing in the field, that is equivalent to this is required. So let me copy this and just paste here and give semicolon. And also one more expectation is expect of whenever this particular element has updated the form control, that form control should update in our register address. That means component instance dot register address dot get of I want to get that email, and inside that we can get the required validation. So for that sake I can use value dot to equal of it should be equal to empty. And one more validation is expect of component instance dot register address dot get of the control name. The control name is email and it should have errors. That errors should not be equal to null, dot not to be null. so it should not be equal to null. And even you can find the particular required one. So expect of component instance dot register address dot get of what is that email, and if you have the errors, and you can find whether the required error exists or not. So dot to be truthy. Why? Because required will give you a boolean value. Let me save this. Now here we have validated all the cases for email. In the same way you can do even for name. So that is the same expectations, but the ID and the particular format will change. Now what we will do, let me test the form arrays. So how we will check the form arrays? So as this test case is going big, just I'll make like email not found, and let me write one more test case like it and test form array addresses. So I want to test this, and let me have a callback function. Inside this callback function, what I will do, I'll get the element, any of the element, random element. So for example, already we are passing two objects for this particular address array. Go to the demo part and see here you have already two addresses by default. So what I'll do, any one of the address I'll access, and inside that I'll try to remove that value, and whenever I remove that value my submit button should disable and this particular element should have one error message. So let's test that. Here let me go to the spec file and let me update the fixture dot detect changes, and once the detect changes are done, let me use one stable dot, then we'll get a callback function. Inside this callback function, let me access that particular elements. How to access the elements of that values? I can access even from the form control or from the HTML content. So now in this case I'll access from the form control itself. So component array dot get, I want to get the group name. The group name is 0, and for that group name I will access a control. That means get of what is my control name. Let me use any of the control name from that form group. So it would be something like a city name, and just copy this city name, paste here, and let me add the value dot set value of empty. Now my address is having a city name, and that city name will be equal to empty. After this, let me update my fixture dot detect changes, and fixture dot when stable. Whenever this is stable, I'll access this dot then, and whenever I'm accessing this dot, then I'll get a callback. Inside this callback, the city name is invalid. That means whole form is invalid. Let's check that. Expect of component instance dot register address dot valid dot to be falsy, or you can use false. Now whenever the city name is in a required state, this is invalid, so the validity is false. Either of the way you can check, either by using a valid property or by invalid property. Whenever you are using an invalid property, try to pass to be truthy. So now save this. We can say that our particular validation has been failed for that particular form. In the same way, you can access any of the element and you can render that data. So this is invalid and it is equal to true. Now one more expectation, like expect of component instance dot, what is my expectation here? The expectation is whenever we are seeing this city name, that city name should be having a validation error called as required. So I can use same thing here. Let me copy this and then paste here, but this time we will not focus on the value, we will focus on the errors, and it should be having errors. So dot not to be null, it should not be null. And the same expectation, but this time we need to have a one more statement called as dot required. It should have a required value, and it should be dot to be truthy. And let me save this. Now all the test cases has been successfully passed. And also one more thing you can check, whenever there is an invalid value, that has to update your submit. Already we have tested in the above test cases. Hope this is good enough for testing our address management by using a form control as well as a form array and a form group. And by this, we have ended our test cases for our address management system. Hope this helps a lot for you regarding the address management system, and hope you like my explanation. If you like my video, like, share, subscribe to my channel for more updates. Signing off. Thank you.